Hey, what's up? This is Scott from Syntax, and in this course, I'm going to take you through the basics of Svelte 5. That's right, the perfect person for this course is somebody who has a bit of JavaScript experience. You've got Node installed, you know how to use NPM, but maybe you haven't ever seen Svelte 5, you just heard about it today. Or maybe you're a React user and wanting to see what the hype is about. Now, we're going to take you through the basics. This is certainly not an intermediate or an advanced course. We're going to show you the syntax. We're going to build an easy little app. But the most important thing is we're going to take it step by step. We're going to explain deep what's going on. So that way you have all of the tools that you need to really foster your creativity. So that way when you start to work on your own applications, you at least know where to look to find techniques. And we're going to be talking about all kinds of things, from the new state runes, effects, components, even the basics of how you create a Svelte component. We're going to be talking about snippets. We're going to be talking about even animations that are built into Svelte. So if you would like to learn Svelte 5, this course is broken up into chapters. If you want to see something specifically, you can use that chapter specifically to learn that little bit. The code is all available on GitHub. And as always, nothing hidden behind a paywall here at Syntax. So follow along as we dive into Svelte 5. It is my favorite framework to work in. Okay, so before we get into any code here or start working on our app, I wanted to spend some time really talking about what makes Svelte and Svelte 5 in particular interesting. If you are already a Svelte user, you can pretty much skip ahead until we're writing code here because you probably know these things, or maybe you just want some more information here. The big reason why Svelte is interesting specifically is because it's a compiled language. When you write Svelte templates, even though it really feels like you're writing HTML, you're having this HTML and simplified JavaScript being able to be compiled into JavaScript, HTML, and CSS in a way that makes it so we're not having to ship as much library code as you typically would. Now, all of the examples in this course can be done by heading to svelte.dev and clicking on REPL, and then working in the code directly there. Since I'm recording this before Svelte 5 has been officially released, I'll be using the preview version, which looks a little bit something like this. Now, I will recommend that you run the commands and do all of these things locally instead of using the REPL, but sometimes it's nice to just get up and running and have some code in front of you working, and I totally get that. So if you want to use the REPL, there's nothing going to stop you from being able to do that in this course. Now, before we actually write some code, let's take a look about what makes Svelte interesting. Like I mentioned, because it's compiled, we can have things like this. This is a non-standard template tag. This is not JavaScript. This is not HTML. This signifies a template tag inside of Svelte. And what happens is that this becomes a compiled reactive variable. When this variable changes, specifically, the variable will update in the HTML. Now, this differs from something like a React-based framework where in a virtual DOM, React-based framework, those types of things, you have a function and your component is a function, and that function will rerun. Every single time something is changed, whether that's a prop or whatever, that function is going to rerun. With Svelte, we're tracking values, not components. So if a prop changes, that value of that prop and anything that relies on that prop changes, but the stuff inside of this is not rerun. So you don't have to worry about how many times your component is re-rendering, because components aren't re-rendering here, it's values. So that's a bit of a mindset shift if you're coming from other frameworks. And if you're not coming from other frameworks, just know that we have variables that are defined with state. And when you define a variable with state and that variable is updated, it is then updated everywhere it is being used. Now, we mentioned that this is compiled, and because of that, it means that whenever we compile a Svelte file, it outputs to actual JavaScript that you can read. Now, you will see that there is some things like where you're importing this $sign from Svelte internal client. Now, unlike something like React, you're actually getting real readable JavaScript that does much less at the library level and much more after being compiled. And if you go into the REPL, you can actually see what this looks like when it's compiled to the server versus the client, if the CSS has been injected or external, whether or not we're in dev mode. You can see that dev mode just looks a little bit differently here. And what's also cool about Svelte is that we can write our CSS, HTML, JavaScript in the same file. So we can do something like style, button, background, red. And the background obviously turns red because we've written the style directly in our template. But in addition to that, the CSS output has a scoped class on it. We're going to dive into this so much more once we start talking about CSS in general and the general strategy about working in CSS. But you can see that we get a distinct JavaScript and CSS output, as well as this AST, which is an abstract syntax tree. This is what these Svelte files are outputting. So it's a really interesting language overall, and what it allows for is exceedingly simple component syntax, meaning that everything inside of Svelte is oftentimes much less code than other frameworks because they can tuck a lot of that complexity under the rug of the compiler. It also means that we end up having smaller component files, less framework code that we're importing, and just generally a nicer, more similar to HTML feel for everything. I like to describe Svelte as being HTML with kind of JavaScript sprinkled in, rather than JavaScript with HTML crammed into it, right? That's just how I think about it. So let's go ahead and let's get started by creating our project. Now, to create a Svelte project, you use the utility npx. This tutorial course assumes that you have Node and therefore npm installed, and it needs to be a version that's new enough that has npx, which is honestly most of them at these days. And what version of Node I'm using is 20.16. That's a bit newer of a version. You don't need that newer of a version. I'm sure 18 would suffice just fine. But this is what I'm using if you want to follow along exactly. Now, to install Svelte, we do npx sv create. And this is going to create a new Svelte kit based site. Now, Svelte kit is the app framework for Svelte. You don't need Svelte kit to write Svelte sites, but it's often the easiest way to get up and running, especially if you're building a website, and it's a great framework overall, so we're going to be using it. That said, we won't be doing many Svelte kit specific things in this course other than just using the general structure of a Svelte kit app. So npx sv create, you can see it's going to say, hey, it's going to first install SV. Now the version may be different considering I know they're actively working on this before release. We'll just say why. And if these screens are a little bit different for you, I'm sure there's a chance they are, but for the most part, it should be the same. So it's going to first ask you where you would like this project to be created. If you don't have anything here, it's going to create this project in the folder that you are in right now. Since I'm in my root tutorials folder, that would be a bad idea. So I'm going to create a new folder, which is just going to be Svelte 5 course. Whatever you would like to name this, you can name this that. That's going to create a new folder and install your app inside of that folder. Now, the options are SvelteKit Demo, Library, or Minimal. We're going to do Minimal, hit Enter, just because we want as little code as possible. We're focusing on Svelte here. Now, you can use any of these options for type checking. I tend to go with just the TypeScript syntax because that's what I'm used to. It is what we will be using in this course, but I won't be focusing too hard on TypeScript topics here. It's just a nice way to be. You can also use JS doc style comments. And for what we would like to add to our project, you'll see kind of some interesting options here, from Drizzle to Tailwind, Playwright, VTest. Now, last time I ran this utility, it had them broken up into different categories. So I do want to stress that this may look different by the time you get to this. And because of that, and because we're keeping it simple in this course, I do just want to add Prettier and ESLint. These two will at least give us the formatting that we need and want while we're working in a new code base, right? We can tell if something's going wrong, but we're not going to be writing tests or doing anything with Tailwind or databases or anything like that. So just hit Enter. Now it's installing everything, and we should be getting up and running in just a second. Okay. There we go. Let's change directories inside of our Svelte 5 course. Let's do an install. If you're using npm, you can do npm install. You can also use pnpm or yarn or any of these things, bun, if you know what those stuff is. But for the most part, I think most people are familiar with NPM, so we'll stick with that. Okay, so NPM installed, and I believe it actually probably installed our dependencies anyways for us. Yeah, installed the dependencies already, but hey, you know what? I kind of always love running NPM install anyways, regardless, just in case. Now, what we'll want to do next, as it says, is npm run dev. Now it gives you this option to -- open, and we can go ahead and do that too, just so that way it runs inside of the browser window that we last had open, and that I don't have to copy and paste a URL here for us. So we're going to do npm run dev. And this site is Vite based, so it is using Vite as a backend build tool and everything like that. And this is great. This is what we get when we have our SvelteKit site. We're also getting out of the box server-side rendering, meaning that our content, even though it's being written in Svelte and JavaScript, is actually available in the DOM right away. Now you can turn this off and go all client-side render. You can go pre-rendering. You can do static sites. You can even do a combination of the two if you are having your sites based on routes. Again, these are all SvelteKit-specific topics that we won't be covering too much here. Now, I'm going to, first and foremost, after we have this up and running, I'm going to open this up in VS Code. You can drag the file into VS Code. You can use code / to open it if you have the command line utility installed, and I'm going to do that. Here we are. Okay. So I'm going to make my code nice and big for you because I think it's important to be able to see the code inside of these videos. And what we will also do is pop this open over here and maybe even close this, make this a little bit more, and this one a little bit more. There we go. Okay, so check this out. This is SvelteKit. I'm going to close the welcome screen. My theme that I'm using, color theme, is Syntax FM. So if you're a fan of Syntax, we do have a Syntax theme for VS Code, and that's what I'm going to be using. So first and foremost, we have our SvelteKit 5 site. It actually works inside of the SRC folder as all of our files. This is pretty much everything we need to worry about right now. And for the most part, we're going to head into routes. Now routes, where we have plus page.svelte, is going to be our page right here. And in fact, welcome to Svelte 5. Save this. You can see it updates, right? We're clearly in the right file. Now, again, we're not going to be focusing too hard on SvelteKit specific things. So if you want to learn more about this page file in the routes folder and the lib folder and stuff, we have content on this channel, as well as the official documentation is a great point to do that. And I think it might be a good opportunity to do a new SvelteKit tutorial course once the next one is released, or Svelte 5. We'll also be covering a lot of transferring Svelte 4 sites to Svelte 5 on this, because the syntax.fm site is built in SvelteKit, and you should get a nice dose of Svelte and SvelteKit there. Okay, cool. Really cool. Cool stuff. Awesome stuff. This is our introduction here. Let's go ahead and write our first bit of Svelte code, right? So this is just a page file. And in typical Svelte files, you end up having a script. Now the script is where you do your imports, it's where you do your JavaScript, it's where you set up your state, it's all of that stuff. But what we want to do in this first section is create our own Svelte file. And we want to use it as a component. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to actually do it in the exact same folder inside of the routes folder. And this will just be header.svelte, right? Most sites need a header, right? And can hit enter. Again, we're going to want to have a script here. Now, the only difference between this script and the last one is I'm going to do lang equals ts. That gives us TypeScript support if you do want that. If you don't, just omit this lang ts. And we're going to say h1 hello from header. Okay? This is our component. And inside of our page.svelte, what we'll want to do is import this header file and then use it as a component. So if we import header from /header.svelte, notice that you do need the .svelte extension here. This is going to allow us to utilize this like a component, just like an element. Now, if you're familiar with React or Vue or any of these other frameworks, this kind of importing a component and using it should be extremely commonplace for you, right? Nothing that you haven't seen before. The only difference is that we're importing a .svelte instead of a JSX, TSX, JS file, whatever, right? And it works nicely because it's pretty explicit that it's a Svelte file. And the convention is to do an uppercase like this. So you don't have to do it that way, but that is the convention. Cool. So you can see here our HTML is updated. Hello from header exists. And all we're doing is importing this component and using it like this. Now, something that differs from other frameworks to Svelte is that oftentimes in Svelte, each component is a single file. I know in React land, sometimes people like to have multiple components in a file or subcomponents or things like that. There are techniques that you can do with Svelte like that using something called snippets, which is a new feature in Svelte 5. But for the most part, you are using what's called a single file component. And anything that you write inside of this component ends up being scoped to that component and that component specifically. That includes CSS, as we mentioned, right? So here we are, and again, I'm going to add a style tag in here because in Svelte land, this is the typical anatomy of a Svelte file, right? We have a script tag up top, you have your HTML here, and you have your CSS. Feels very HTML, right? And because everything except for maybe how the reactivity stuff works in Svelte or the template tags does feel very HTML forward. So let's talk about something called props. Now, props exist in most frameworks these days, and a prop is essentially when you pass a variable from somewhere into a component. And typically that is done with the prop is equal to prop value format like this. I'm getting some red squigglies because this prop does not exist, right? But this is the typical way you do that. And then inside of your header, you would have access to the variable there, meaning that you can pass one thing down from one to another. That's like a very common way to pass information from component to component. So here's how we create props inside of Svelte. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a prop inside of the header component. And to do that, you say let, and then you have curly brackets because this is going to be destructuring, is equal to $props like this. This means whatever variable we create here will be available to have information passed into it. So if we want to say name, that means that in our page.svelte, we can say name is equal to something like Scott, okay? So this allows us to pass the value, a string of Scott, into header, and in our side of our header, we should now have access to that, and we can replace the words from header with our template tag of name, and our output now says hello Scott. Notice how we do so within curly brackets. In Svelte, anything inside of curly brackets, it can be a variable, it's a JavaScript expression, right? Very similarly to how you use this in JSX and React land. This is a JavaScript expression, meaning you could do something like name is equal to Tim, and it's going to be false, right? Name is equal to Scott, and it's equal to true. So this can be a JavaScript expression any way you have it. Now you might be wondering about syntax highlighting and stuff like that. If you type in Svelte for VSCode Extensions, the one you want is Svelte language for, or Svelte for VSCode. Do not install Svelte IntelliSense. It pops, it's deprecated, it pops open a bunch of windows when it shouldn't, and Svelte Extensions for Svelte also contains this Svelte IntelliSense. The only one you need is this official checkmark Svelte for VSCode, okay? That's what I'll be using here. Okay, back to the program, okay? So we now have name coming in from props. Now, TypeScript folks out there might want to know how we give name a type, because right now it's type of unknown. Again, we're not going to focus too hard on TypeScript stuff, but I will call out when we need it. To do that in TypeScript, you just do a colon, and then you have access to your types like this. And so now name is the type of string, and we know it's a type of string. So when you define types inside of Svelte, you're often doing so in the pretty standard way that you define types for a variable, okay? I will be leaving the TypeScript code in here. If you find it obnoxious, feel free to not use it, but I do like the assurance that it gives me that I'm writing the code correctly. Now, you may have wondered about this little weird $props syntax. The $sign inside of Svelte 5 is something brand new, and it's called runes. In the past, you exported a prop, and it was always kind of confusing to people. Inside of Svelte, they really leaned hard into the $sign, and then what you're using, and then a function. So $sign props to create a prop, $sign state to create a state, there's derived, there's effect, there's a whole bunch of things, and we're going to be talking about all of those throughout this course. We'll be talking exactly what they do, and this course again is going to be really getting into the basics of Svelte here. We're not going to be going super advanced use cases, but I do think it's important to notice that whenever you see this $sign props, you're seeing that this is a Svelte language feature, declares a prop that the component accepts, right? So again, they're called runes. You'll see that in the documentation. A rune, again, is just kind of like a symbol, and in this case, it's the $sign symbol letting you know that there's something important going on here. Okay, sick. That's all great. We have now our first Svelte component, which is header.svelte. We have our page. Now, before we get into state, let's go ahead and head to our page.svelte, and I want to show you something else we can do with props here. Now, just like we can do anything inside of Svelte scripts that's JavaScript, we can create a variable, something like let name is equal to Scott, like so. And then you can use that name value inside of your JavaScript expressions, inside of your template tags. And in other JavaScript frameworks, the way you do that is like this. However, the coolest thing about Svelte, and not the coolest thing, but everything's the coolest thing about Svelte. One of the cool things about Svelte is that this actually works how you might expect it to in other frameworks, where if you, and I'll save this, if you do it like this, that's the equivalent of saying name is equal to name. Other frameworks might take this to be a Boolean value for some reason. That never makes any sense to me. So if we want to pass the same value name into the same prop name, like we have name here, we're passing name into name. This is the syntax for it. It's so concise and lovely, and I feel like everybody should adopt this. I don't know why they haven't by now. And likewise, we can come in here and you can see that this still doesn't change. Everything is working as expected. Now, to reiterate too, even that these are just JavaScript expressions, let's even do some real JavaScript here. Like if we wanted to replace the T's in my name with uppercase T's, or maybe even replace them with X's or something, right? We could do name.replace, and we could replace T with X like this. And obviously, if we wanted to replace all of them, you'd replace all. And you can see this is powerful because we can write some JavaScript expressions directly inside of this template, right? That's pretty neat. Okay, now let's get into the part where we're talking about state. Now, state is fascinating inside of Svelte because in the past, state used to be declared as, well, it was a value, right? And in this case, if we were to find name like this, name would be a state value and it'd be reactive. You would change name, that would change reactively. But in Svelte 5, they did away with that. And now we're using something called state, which is another rune. So if we wanted to try this again, like let name is equal to Scott, we could say let name is equal to $state. And the default value of our state comes inside of here and is just Scott like this. Okay, so let name is equal to state Scott. Now, people who are familiar with Svelte 4 might see this as a downgrade, but one of the things that was hard with Svelte 4 was that it was often ambiguous which variables were changing and which ones weren't, how they were changing, what they needed to do, and it often sometimes led to either confusing or non-performant code. So with Svelte 5, we now have $state, and we can set a default value like this. Now, let's get some fun stuff going on inside of here and show you how we can make this extremely easily reactive. We can say input, so it's just a straight up text input. And I'm sorry, I'm not going to do a whole lot of full-on HTML accessibility stuff in this. We're not building a label. I'm focusing really hard on Svelte 5 specific features and Svelte specific features. So all of your accessibility needs and everything HTML best practices should still apply, right? So the type is of text, the input type of text, and we're going to use this nice little directive on an HTML element called bind. And if we bind the value of name, And what this means is that every single time we update a value of this input, the name value will update, and this therefore will pass into the header, and the header will update. So by using bind value, we are binding whatever the value is of this input to this variable. You can see it even starts off by default as Scott. So we can say Wes. And notice how this updates immediately, right? We didn't have to do an onChange function to update the state or anything like this. It's a nice and simple bind. It works super well. And this is one of the nicest features of Svelte overall, is that we can bind variables. You can also bind other things, right? You can even bind a variable to an HTML element, so that way you get access to the element itself as a variable. That's pretty cool. There's a lot more there, but bind value is the way you most commonly use this. So here we go. But again, because we have JavaScript expressions inside of here, anytime we type a lowercase t, what do we get? We get an X in this second one. So again, if we start typing Scott, so you can see how that reactive JavaScript expression is super nice, right? So input type text bind value name. That's a state variable. Okay, let's dive into some more state things. Like for instance, let's say we wanted to have a status. So we can say let status. You can often think about these as like whether or not something is open or closed, right? You could say state, and this could be open. And for TypeScript folks, we define the type again by just typing the variable itself. So we could say this will either be open or it will be closed, okay? And we're getting red squigglies because I don't have a lang equals ts here. There we go. Now, one thing you'll notice, though, that name will have a type because it is inferred from this, where this would have been inferred as a string unless you told it what it was. This is pretty much standard inside of TypeScript overall. So we have our status now, and let's say we wanted to have our status displayed. We could just have, let's have even like a paragraph tag here that says the store is now status. Okay, the store is now open. Let's make a button here to change that. We can have a button, which will be toggle status. Now, with something like this, we can start to use events. Now, in Svelte past, you would do this with on click like so, right? You use the on directive on click. And in React JSX land, you for some reason do on click like camel case, like a JavaScript style. But we're working with HTML here, folks. So we get to do on click like this. On click could be then referencing a function that we haven't created yet. Perhaps it's named toggle. So we could say function toggle, and this is just a function like this. And here we can update our state by saying status is equal to, and then we can do just a ternary operation here. So we can say status is equal to if status is equal to open, then make it closed, otherwise have it open. Right? So that way if status is closed, it becomes open, or status is open, it becomes closed. Now you'll notice a difference between other JavaScript frameworks and Svelte in that with Svelte, you actually update the variable itself. You mutate the variable, and that actually is what triggers the reactivity. There is no .set state, which means that these things, when you declare them like state like this, they largely function, and there's caveats here, but they largely function just like straight up variables, right? And this is really nice because now we don't have to have this whole destructuring of a set state and a state itself. We don't have to have a state creation that way. We just end up having a variable that you can have reactively. So if we want to try this now, this should work if we toggle our status, open, closed. The store is now open or closed. Really nice. And this works super duper well. It's pretty easy to read, right? We just have our simple toggle function. Again, we're just updating a variable, and that variable is reactive because it's a state. Now let's go ahead and show you another cool trick, because normally this is how you do it, right? You have a function, it's named toggle. That function just, it describes what it does. But sometimes you're in a component that is so specialized and it has one on-click function, right? Like the only point of this component is that it runs an on-click. or even just that there's only one event. And in that case, let me comment this out, and you can actually name this function onClick. And just like what we did with props before, we can name this onClick, and you'll see that you can just do it as brackets onClick. That's a nice little shorthand. I end up using this all the time, specifically because, heck, a lot of these single-use components, you build a component, it's so scoped to what it does, and it has one button, it makes sense to have the onClick be named this. Oh, hey, you click the button, it's what it does, right? Now, in addition to that, if you wanted to get in line with it, I know this is a common technique in React land, you can do that as well, where you say onClick, and again, we have access to JavaScript expressions inside of a bracket. So we could say onClick, and now I'm running a function. And that function could, in fact, be this variable setting code right here. Okay, so this right here is the inline version of something like this. And you could see it will still work here. This is the one being utilized, and the other one will still work as well. So you have a lot of different strategies here that you can do for these types of things. But as you can see, onClick will work just like this. onClick will work just like this, and we can do all sorts of stuff. If you're the type of person who likes to throw all your code in the template, right, this is typically how you'll see it being done. I know that's fairly common in other frameworks. If you're the type of person who likes to keep it all separated, this is how it works right here. And if you're the type of person who likes to be very explicit with what it does, you can name it what it does and pass that in. Cool, so this is state inside of Svelte. Now, there's a lot more here because we have things like derived state, we have frozen state, we have these kinds of things. We're going to be talking quite a bit more about that. And that's what we're going to be talking about next. So this is a state. It's pretty amazing, right? It functions very nice and easy. Let's actually talk about state in a different way, because you can actually get into some more interesting scenarios with different ruins with state. And I mentioned that we're not going to be getting too much into the super advanced use cases in Svelte, but this is a fairly common one, okay? And this would be like, let's say you have a value and a value that depends on another value, and that's reactive. The best example I can come up with is you have a shopping cart, right? The shopping cart has numerous items that have a price. And in the very most bare bones simple example, that might just be an array of prices, right? And then you have your total. That total would always be calculated by adding up the same prices. If you add something to that array, you change something in that array, you want that total to always stay in sync. So this is a derived variable, as in it derives its value from another state. So a cool example of this might be let full name is equal to, and then we can say $, because again, this is a rune, this is something special, derived. And what we could take access in here is say name plus a space. Let's do an empty space. And then plus, we'll do this, Tolinsky as a string. You can do whatever your last name is. And now we can use the full name down here, and we can pass that full name, or we can just put it into, we're just dumping this into HTML right now. We can just put it in H2. And this H2 you can see now says Scott Tolinsky. Now what's great about this is that anytime the name changes, then full name will change as well. So if I wanted to say Courtney Tolinsky, you can see that hello Courtney, the X obviously is there from the T, but she also gets Courtney Tolinsky here, and this is all derived from this value. You could obviously do it where the full name is hard encoded into a template string in here, but this is a kind of trite example for how you might use this. Like I mentioned, you could actually even run a function inside of a derived by and have that add up the totals of something. You could have a value that is always going to be staying in sync, and you want it to be possibly reused elsewhere throughout your code. And so it's not just being used once in the template or anything like that. You'll end up finding yourself using derived values anytime you have a state value that depends on the value of another state. Now that we've dove into some deeper topics on state, I'm going to dive into one deeper topic inside of props, because we talked about props looking like this. Now, granted, this is the TypeScript version. Without this, it would look, just like an object definition. You might be wondering, how do we do optional props inside of Svelte? Because right now, name is a required prop, and you can tell by the type signature that it needs to have a value, right? Not only that, we're actually using it. This method depends that it exists. So name needs to be there. And TypeScript will yell at us if we remove name from header, right? There we go. And it'll say name is missing in type, okay? But what about optional props? Props that you might not have. Well, those types of props can be done using something like this. So if we define another prop name, we can just have this be a fake name. So here we have fake name, and we can give this we can say this is a string, and you can use the TypeScript syntax of having a question mark in here. Now, we aren't using fake name here, but let's come to our page, and you'll see that TypeScript now knows that fake name is optional. Granted, we can pass fake name in here, and it will know that it's optional, right? However, how do you do this with TypeScript? Or without TypeScript, I should say. Without TypeScript, you could give this a default value. And you could say the default value is something like null. Obviously, you'd have to update the type to say that it could be string or null. But then what you have here, if you don't have TypeScript, you're not using that, you have something that has a default value. And if you then pass another actual value into it, it will then show up. So again, let's drop this in here. We could say fake name just down here. You'll notice that nothing is broken right here. If we come into our page, header is not complaining that fake name doesn't exist. But if we do add a fake name is equal to Wes, then it will be output, okay? So you can have a default value set for this. If you set it to be null, it's like a totally optional prop, and then you can do your control flow to check to see if fake name exists or not, and then display it. Or you could even have a default value in here like Wes. And we can remove this null. This still says the prop is optional, so we need that. It could be undefined. And if we head back to our page, you could remove fake name from here, and it will always display as Wes. So a lot of this stuff does feel like it is very just JavaScript stuff, right? If this is how you define a default value in a function or anytime inside of JavaScript, and it works the same way inside of here. Just likewise, when you define types, it's the same as defining types in JavaScript. People often describe Svelte as being magical, and the only magical things inside of Svelte are just these kind of things like this, where we have props or this template syntax. But for the most part, the way it works is real JavaScript, real HTML, and it's combined in a way that just feels really great, okay? Cool. So the next topic we're going to be getting into is logic. Then we're going to be getting into something called snippets, then lifecycle methods, and then we're going to dive into things like animations and all sorts of cool stuff, because Svelte 5 has a lot you can do out of the box. We're going to be focusing largely on stuff that you might need in most applications, but largely getting up and running in Svelte 5. So if you need to take a break, now is a good time to do that. However, let's get into it where we start talking about using logic inside of your templates. Okay, let's keep this going, and we're going to dive into template logic here, because we have done a little bit with these template tags. We've shown you how you can use JavaScript expressions, but unlike React and other frameworks, Svelte has the ability to use real template tags for things like if statements and loops, which means we don't have to do any of these weird double ampersand tricks or ternaries where you shouldn't have to, or even a map for a loop because you needed an array for some reason, right? You don't care about those little details with Svelte. What you care about is the way that the template reads. And the template reads using template tags such as pound if or pound each, those types of things. And there's a handful of these template tags that, well, will make your code do the types of things you need it to do. Okay, so let's actually head to our page.svelte once again. And you'll remember that the way we had this working was we had a name, a status, a full name. I'm going to start getting rid of some of this stuff in favor of some new state in which we're going to be using to build an actual pseudo app here, right? Nothing crazy. So let's go ahead and just get rid of this stuff. And likewise, I'm going to get rid of all of this stuff as well. We'll just clear this out, right? Get a nice little, if you want to make sure that you have this code for later, obviously duplicate this file or make a new file or something, but I want to keep moving here. And we're going to be using a lot of the techniques we showed before anyways. So let's go ahead, and what we're going to create first is a form underscore state. Now, actually, let me do this in camel case. I prefer snake case. That's a me thing, so I'm not going to force that on you here in this course. So I'm going to do everything in camel case like most JavaScript folks do. So form state is going to look like this, where we have a state, and inside of our state we're going to have an object, where that name is going to be an empty string first and foremost, and then we're going to have another property which is birthday, which is also going to be an empty string. Okay, so this is just the general form state. Now, another thing we can add in here is a step, which step we're on in the form, because this will be a multi-step form. So we can just call this step like this, and the initial value can be 0. And lastly, we can have another property, which is error. You know, potentially if there's an error in this form, this is the entire state for this form. Now, if you were doing this as a serious project, you might have like a fields sub-object here, but I'm going to keep it fairly simple. That way we don't have to get too deep here. Okay, so this is our form state, and this is what we're going to be using for most things. Now, I want to first and foremost say we're going to have a main tag here, and inside of our main tag, we're going to say what step we're at. So step is equal to, and inside of this template tag, we're going to say form state dot step. Okay. We can save this. You can see it now says step 0. I'll even bump up the size here. Okay, nothing crazy there. So let's go ahead and talk about how we can do this with first if statements, and then eventually we're going to get into things like loops, right, using each, which aren't really that crazy, but I think it's good to take a step-by-step approach. So if we want to do an if statement, it's as simple as saying pound if, and then the conditional statement that you need to have. So if we want to say form state dot step is equal to 0, so if the form state dot step is equal to 0, and then we can finish this off with a / if, right? This is a basic if statement inside of Svelte. Nothing wild here. Inside of this very first form step, we're going to have a div, inside of that a label, and the label is going to be for name. It's going to say your name, and we're going to have an input here. The input type is going to be of text. It's going to have an ID of name, and the value is just like we did before. It's going to bind the value. We're going to bind the value, and this time you'll notice that we can actually bind the value of a nested property inside of an object. So in this case, it's form state dot name. Okay, so this actually works anytime you want to do this. In fact, this is one of the reasons why people like Svelte form and variable binding so much, right? You could have a deeply nested object that represents the total shape of your form and have all the values bind, and then you don't have to have all these individual update functions for your fields, and you can still have what would be considered a controlled form because you then have access to these form values throughout your code, and you can do things like if statements on them. So let's go ahead and now have a button in here, and this button is simply going to just say next, okay? And we're going to have an on-click event here, and this is going to say on-click is equal to, and then we can have an inline function for now, just because we want to see this in action. We're going to say if form state.name is not equal to an empty string, then what we can do is we can increment our form step. Form state.step plus equals 1. Now, a lot of people don't like the plus equals thing, so you could always do form state.step +1 here. That works just fine as well. But what you're going to see here is that because the if statement is checking to make sure that that form state step is equal to 0, if I first try to click this, you'll see nothing happens. And then if I enter my name, I can click next, and it disappears entirely, and step increases by 1. Now, this doesn't persist or anything, so if I refresh the page, we're back to normal. Now, another thing you could do in this if statement here is just add an else, and if the form state name is empty, you can add to your form state.error form your name is empty. Please write your name. Okay, great little error message right here, right? Wow, okay, super cool. And we should also add a form state.error to clear this out if case we have a non-errored form state. Okay, nice and easy. Let's actually add that error into our form as well. And I'm just going to throw it right up here at the top. We're not building anything beautiful here. And before I type this, I think this might be a good opportunity for you to just try to get this working. Now, granted, this should not be a hard lift, but if you're new to Svelte, you want to make sure that you get it right. Try to code this with maybe even not looking at this code below and just do your best to write an if statement. Otherwise, what we do is we just do $if, and then we were to say form state dot error. So if the form error exists, and then we can finish off this if block here. If the form error exists as a non-null value or empty string, falsy value, right? Then what we'll want to do is display a paragraph with a class of error and just output the form state.error itself. Okay, nice and easy. So this way, now if we click next, you can see it comes up with an error here. Now it's shoving the UI down. This isn't a type of UI I would typically build if I'm building a fancy form, but of course we're not doing that here. Next thing I want to do is add on to our if statement here for our form step. Now this code is going to be kind of wet for now. We're going to make it drier later on, but I don't want to spend too much time on those details while we're just learning these template tags. And so likewise, if you have an if, you can also have a colon else, okay? And an else block functions the exact same that you might expect an else to function in JavaScript. In addition to that, you can also do an else if, and then if form state dot step is equal to 1, right? Now we're just kind of hand coding each form step individually. Then you're going to want to show what we have next. And likewise, what I want to do is just copy this whole first one here because we're going to utilize quite a bit of this for now until we make this drier. And we're going to change, the only thing we're really going to change here is we'll say that the label for is B-Day, the ID is B-Day, your birthday, and the type is no longer going to be text, but it's going to be a type of date. Okay, and we can keep this bind value, but we're going to change it to birthday. Okay, nice and easy. And likewise, if we come down here, we can say form state.birthday. If it's an empty string, or if it's not an empty string, increment and then reset the error. If it is, your birthday is empty. Please write your birthday. Wow, these error messages, fantastic, right? Okay, so again, let's click this. You can see we get an error. Okay, let me actually write my name, Scott, next. All right, now step 1, your birthday, and then we have this form. We can click next, and now we're at step 2. Now, one thing you may be noticing while we're doing this is that we have a zero-based indexing here. So the whole step 1, 2, 3 thing, there's a kind of multiple ways you could solve this. You could just start this with step 1. You could show this as +1, and you can adjust these numbers. When we start getting into doing this as a loop, though, we are going to have index-based 0, which is why I'm keeping this as 0 for now. And we're just going to add a +1 here to the form state.step just for the display. Okay, so just by doing this simple expression here, that just fixes the display of it. Because again, we're going to eventually take this into a loop loop, and I want to keep that zero-based indexing, at least for now. Okay, super cool, and we should have this all working. Now, obviously, if you're the type of person who writes a lot of code, framework, or otherwise, you're going to see so many places we could stop repeating ourselves. Simply just checking the field to see if it's empty, and then either incrementing, setting the error, or just changing a simple string here. This obviously could be all refactored into a single function, but that's not super important right now. What's important is that we have learned that you can do a pound if and a pound else if and a pound else, and then you always need to finish it off with a /if. This is just like a closing of an HTML tag, and this is very typical. You'll see this / anytime you need to close a block of a Svelte tag, whether that's a loop or an if statement or anything. There's even a promise one where you can do await, right? Pretty neat. So this is a great introduction to template tags and conditional logic within your Svelte templates. I love this about Svelte because it's so readable, right? We're not having ampersands all over the place and just kind of ambiguous things. We're seeing straight up if form state is equal to 0, if form state exists, the type of things that you typically write. And this is one of the reasons I like Svelte so much. Now, before we get into the next template tag we're going to cover, which is looping with each, I want to talk about CSS. Now, CSS in Svelte is also pretty amazing. Believe it or not, I think most things in Svelte are amazing. But if we want to have CSS, you can have a style tag directly in your single file component, and we can target this with a simple class here. Error is going to get a color of red. Okay, we can click here. You can see that that is now the color of red. But what I want to stress about CSS inside of Svelte is that it is tightly scoped to the component itself. And any CSS classes that are defined in children components or parent components of error will not get this color of red, because anytime we write CSS in a Svelte component, it is only affecting what is in the component itself. And now this could work for any selector. Let's say we have a div. You could just have a background of blue, right? And this is going to have any div and give it a background of blue. This is a paragraph, right? So this is the background of blue. Any div within this component is going to have a background of blue. But let's go ahead and really quickly add back in our header component here. And I'm going to quickly set the name is equal to form state.name. Okay. And we'll go ahead and modify this header real quick. We can get rid of the hello part. We can get rid of the replace all and even the fake name stuff. Let's get rid of all this. Okay. We can simply just have a div, and inside of that div is going to be an h1, and inside of this h1 we're going to say pound if name, if we can have an h1 name form. Okay, so if I type my name, it's going to have a names form. So I can say Scott, and this is now Scott's form. But again, this is inside of a div, and this is inside of a div. But because the style is scoped to that component, this div right here does not get any of the CSS. This is a feature that could be considered frustrating to newer developers of Svelte, but seasoned CSS practitioners will find this to be incredible, because we have now the total freedom to write global CSS for when we want global properties, but we also have tightly scoped CSS, meaning that if you end up having a component that is this simple, we don't have to worry about naming classes. A common thing that you might do in other frameworks is this is the header, so you give this a class of header, and then you come to your CSS and you .header, right? Now we have the same name 3 times in the file, the class, even though that class is not leaking out, or maybe it is. Maybe you're even using a component to encapsulate that, like styled components. So in this case, you could even just say div is a background of red. You have to have a semicolon there, and you can see it just gets it. And that won't leak out of this component, meaning that if you have very simple component trees, then your CSS selectors can be simple as well. This works by actually adding special classes to each div. You can see this, or each item. Anytime we give a selector to something, it gets this scoped class, and that CSS is added as actual CSS with that scoped class. This all happens behind the scenes and is super automatic. It's one of my favorite features of Svelte, just like so many others, but it's really, really great for productivity when you're writing CSS. Now, I mentioned that these styles don't leak. If we get rid of this red one, you can see obviously this doesn't turn blue based on what we just talked about. But what if, and I don't recommend this because I recommend putting these styles in a global style sheet, but there are certainly scenarios where maybe you have some code that's being generated and that code is some child and there's some classes in here, and you might want to give this a class and it's just not being scoped correctly. Well, you can actually add global CSS into your style sheets with this :global function, selector function here, just like this. And now if I type in my name here, you can see that the blue now leaks out because I've said that, hey, this div is global. Now, who knows if this will ever change based on the scope property coming to CSS. I'd have to imagine it just changes how it happens behind the scenes. But again, this is how you do it. If you want to have global CSS, you do it just like this. All right, let's get rid of this entirely here, and let's go back to the way our form looks. And I do want to modify this header bit. And also what I want to do, I want to move the error message. First thing I'm going to move the error message below the form. I'm tired of things pushing other elements around because I think that's bad UX. And even though we're not focusing on good UX here, it just bugs me, right? Okay. So the form error is now below the form. It doesn't push anything out of the way. But if we start typing, it's going to push the form down. So let's head to our header and let's change this if statement, because so far we've only shown if statements inside of wrapping around elements. Now you could put this if statement directly inside of here, right? So you could do inside of the H1, you could have the if name like this, right? And let's get rid of this. There's nothing stopping you from doing this. Now you may notice that this could probably be written as a single inline one, and typically that's how I would approach this as well. And if we're being honest here, I would do this in a ternary, so that way I could say if the name exists, then show the name, otherwise just show a string that says user. Okay, let's refresh this. Users form, Scott. Now it doesn't bump anything down. Now it all just works, right? All right, we're building ourselves a nice little form here. We have if statements going. We've learned quite a bit about how CSS works inside of Svelte, and we're ready to start getting into looping before we get into lifecycle, things like side effects, on mounts, and those types of things. It's because I know that if most people were to look at this, you'd say, if form step is equal to 0, this is not sustainable. If we keep adding questions, if we want more questions than what's offered, you're going to have to keep updating the template. That's obviously not a great way to do it, right? So you have a couple of strategies here if you want to start abstracting out individual questions or questions themselves into their own component. But believe it or not, we can actually use a new feature of Svelte called a snippet, which allows you to essentially define a reusable chunk of code directly inside of your Svelte template. And this could be seen as the way of, in like a React component, you just create a second function and you can use that as a component in your file. This is that technique, right? So what we can do here is we can say pound, just like we do any other template tag, and we can say snippet. And this is going to be a question. And actually, I'm going to change it from question because I have a feeling, a sinking feeling I'm going to use that word. We're going to say form step, okay? And form step is going to look like this. We obviously need a closing snippet as well. Now, each form step is going to look like what we had before, but I think it's probably better off at this point to just type it out by hand. So first and foremost, we're going to have a wrapping div, and actually let's wrap the whole thing even in an article. So each question here is going to have a div where we have a label, and the for property is now going to be what could be considered the form ID, like this. And likewise, the form label is going to be the question itself, Now these values don't exist yet, but we will make them exist in a second. And likewise, we'll have an input, and the input is going to be the type of, and check this out. We're just going to get to say this. We're going to pass a type prop in here, and that's going to define the type of the input. The ID is going to be the ID like this, and we're going to bind the value of this individual one into form, step, and then the ID itself. Now, before we work on the incrementing or anything like that, let's just get this working first. So if we have this form step, we can actually, inside of this function, put our props in here. So question, ID, type, okay? And we can even give this TypeScript types as well. So we can do colon and give these types if you would like, if you're doing that type of thing. And type, you could say type is going to be whatever various form types you might have. You could do that as string literals. You could probably use an actual type for that, but for simplicity's sake, we're going to say string. We're going to say the type of ID is also a string, and the question itself is going to be a string. And I'm sorry, I'm already seeing a typo I made. I wrote form step here. This should be form state. We're accessing the form state itself, not the form step, which is the name of this snippet. I was wondering why that error looked so odd. Now, I'm not going to bother with this type right now. This is more of a TypeScript thing where it's expecting, an actual value within form state rather than a string here. It's not Svelte related, so we can fix that later. But as you can see here, we can type this just like any other function. And just like kind of like how React works, this is just a function that we can then run. However, the way that you run it, which is with the @render, which is typically used for rendering things, like if you need to render an HTML string. Let's go ahead and actually nuke out like all of this code here and just get this going, because you know what, we don't need it. We'll nuke out all of that, and we'll say we're going to @render, and then we're going to render the form step like this. And the form step right now could just be considered a question with a what's your name, ID of name, and type of text, okay? And you can see this does render our form element really well. Obviously, there's no next button. It's not the exact thing we had, but this is how a snippet works. And you can see that that binding that we have even works across components, because the snippet right here still has access to everything in this script. So if you define form state up in this script, you then have also access to it within this snippet. In addition, you can pass in values into the snippet just like any typical function and utilize them in the snippet's code. This is super handy for when you just need a quick each loop, and maybe you're just throwing things in a list item or something and you don't want to have that just sitting in your template for some reason. It's just a really nice new feature, and it's the type of thing where maybe you're just prototyping, getting something going, and then you might move this into a component of its own later with minimal effort. Okay, so these are snippets. Now, before we get into looping over things to output the snippet, I want to show you something else with snippets, because it's a really great new feature, and snippets are how you render children inside of a Svelte component, because children ends up becoming an automatic snippet prop. Now, you might not understand what I'm saying right now, but let's show you here. And I'm going to show you with the header. In a typical component like this, you'll have a self-closing component. But not every component is like that. And you can have a closing component like this, and you can pass something into it. So, hello. Whether or not this is just so you write a component as a wrapper, as a very common technique, or maybe it's a route, there's a lot of reasons why you might do this. But this is a very common technique in most front-end frameworks to be able to pass in HTML inside of your components this way to encapsulate it inside of your component. Now, to do this and have this actually output in here, we'll want to head to our header component. And what's interesting is that Svelte has a now built-in prop named children. And the way you type this in TypeScript is by saying children is the type of snippet like this, and this is an import that you have to do, import type snippet from Svelte. I know a lot of people don't care about this TypeScript stuff, but we want to have it anyways. And likewise, what we can do inside of our template tag is we can say @render children like this as if it's a function. And you can actually pass things in this function and have it work just like a snippet does. It's just a little bit more effort. Which brings us to the last snippet technique I want to show you really quick, which is, oh, and sorry, we have a red squiggly. I wrote children. Not a word, children. There we go, fixed. Now, this is going to bring me to the last snippet topic I want to hit before we get into loops. I know I keep putting that off. But if we have an inline snippet where you do snippet like this, and we can give this a name of second child, and this snippet of second child can look just like the snippet that we had down below, where you close it off with snippet. And this snippet second child will be like second child, like this. Now it's going to complain that this second child prop doesn't exist, but I'll show you how we can get this going. In the past in Svelte, we use something called slots, and a slot is a very common technique. I don't know necessarily why they changed it to snippet. I think they probably just made snippet and decided, hey, this is actually a very similar technique. I can't say for certain that they don't want to have multiple ways to do the same thing, but this works just like this does. The only difference is now that this has become a named slot, a named child, meaning that inside of our HTML, see how this is accessed with render children? We could put this in an entirely different type of element here. Like we could put this, if we really wanted to, in an H3, and we can say @render second child like this. Now we have to make sure we add our second child to our props, second child, and then snippet second child. Sorry if I'm going fast. I'm going to show you this in just a second. Move this all around. Okay, so you can see that we have now typed our second child as a snippet. We have a second child coming in as a prop, and we're able to pass second child into wherever we want in the DOM structure. This means you can have various sections in the DOM do various different things. If you want to have children going to multiple areas, they're not just being plopped in one spot. These are essentially being turned into individual props that you can then render like this. And again, what's neat about this is that you can pass information upwards. So the second child's name is, and I'll say Scott. I am a second child, so I'll just say Scott is the value that we're passing in here. And then we can head to second child itself. And believe it or not, you have access to this value now. Second child name is Scott. Now, TypeScript is going to be angry about this, but again, this is not a TypeScript course, so the docs on how to get this fully typed are in the Svelte docs, if that's the type of thing you want to know. But it's very, very interesting to know that you can pass information upwards from a component into a snippet, just like you would in a render prop type of situation inside of React. This is, again, is maybe not a super common thing that you need to do, but it does exist if you need to do it. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and just undo a lot of what we just did with these snippets. This is a little bit of an exploration into snippets, and I want to say it's a detour, so I apologize if you were excited to get into loops, but I'm going to go ahead and remove the second child and the children from our props and just delete them entirely, just so you can have that. When you're looking in the docs, it's under snippets. I just wanted to show you that was possible, okay? Okay, so let's get into our loop stuff now, actually. So what we're going to have first and foremost is an array of questions. And this can just be a const, and I like an all uppercase true constant questions. If you don't like that, then don't do it. But basically, we're just going to have an array full of questions, where in the same shape of the data that we talked about before, you're going to have a question value, which is a string. We can say, what is your name? You can always copy and paste these from the questions that we had written before. We can have an ID. That ID is going to be of name, and the type is going to be of text. Okay? Before we add the birthday one, let's go ahead and get this working with a loop, because right now what we're doing is we're just rendering this snippet. So if we want to loop over an array, you do pound each, and then you do pound each the array name as the array value. And if you wanted to add a key to this loop like you do in React, you do parentheses and then whatever the key may be. So in this case, it could be question.id, since we know that's going to be unique. Now the last thing we'll want to do here is we'll want to close out this each, right? And I think because I had an error, I might need to refresh. There we go. You can see here what it's now doing is it's certainly only outputting our current form, but it is going to loop over all of the questions and output them with this render form step. Now we are hard coding these, so we can remove this what's your name. But before I do that, I want to show you something interesting that we can do as well. Just like we have each questions as question, you could then output inside of here question.name, and it will show you the question. We don't have a name property, question.id. It will show you the value for question ID. It shows up right here. But we can also destructure values here. So I'm going to keep this as an old version of this, but I'm going to have the new destructured version right here. And what we can do is destructure our object properties out of here. So like ID, question, type, and likewise we'll want to change this question.id to just be ID. So we've now been able to destructure each individual property out of here, and we're going to pass those in as question, ID, and type. Now this is the explicit way where you're showing exactly what's passed in here. But bear with me here as I show you a smoother way we could even do this further using what we had initially. So if we go with what we had initially, I'll duplicate this last line and then comment this out here, uncomment this one. And we can pass in the entirety of question in here like this. Now that only works in this particular instance where what we're passing into form step matches what we're grabbing from question one-to-one, right? And many times you will find yourself destructuring properties outside of an each statement. So both techniques are totally valid based on what you need. I just wanted to show you that you could do either. So we did mention that you could do a keyed block for this with an ID here or anything that's unique. If you have an each loop, the reason why you want a keyed block is that it is so that the renderer understands exactly what is what here. It gives it an ID for things. Now that doesn't necessarily mean you always need a key. Some people will say always use a key, but if I'm looping over, let's say, an array of strings in my header navigation and they do not change ever, they're not interactive, it's just outputting them to the DOM, I don't really use a key there. And I like that about Svelte because that's not changing. The DOM shouldn't care about that. Those things are just going to stay the same, and therefore, why do you need a key? You know, that's just my personal outlook. Again, some people like keys on everything. This should work just fine, though. I tend to use keys when whatever I have inside of the array loop ends up being dynamic in any sort of kind of way. Okay. So now that we have each question output here, let's go ahead and add our second question here to keep this rolling. And we can say the second question is going to be, what's your birthday? It's going to be an ID of bday, and it's going to be the type of text like this. What's your name? What's your birthday? Pretty cool, pretty cool. You say Scott right here, likewise. So this is definitely working still. Again, it's outputting both of them now. We'll only want to output them one at a time in just a second. Again, we're just kind of taking things at piece by piece, and we're not building the most effective app here, but we're learning the techniques inside of Svelte. So you'll notice that this isn't very flexible. Right now, this structure has to match this structure entirely. But what if this structure changes and this one doesn't? That's obviously, you know, I guess this structure wouldn't need to change, but the properties here would need to change if for some reason they didn't match up one-to-one. Specifically, like what we mentioned here, you might not have noticed, but we already have a bug in this where the ID is bday, but the property value here is birthday, right? That's going to cause a problem. So what do? Well, we can make an answers value here, and it's just going to be equal to an empty object. We'll need a comma there. And now the way this is going to work, in fact, let's change this ID to birthday just to be explicit, right? So what is your name? What is your birthday? And instead of formState.name here, we can do formState.answers.name. Now, name may or may not exist, and right now it's going to say it doesn't exist. But again, this is going to be a TypeScript thing to unravel. At the end of the day, you would be getting the values of this ID field in some complex TypeScript to pass them in as the potential values inside of answer. Again, not something we're interested in spending too much time in on this course. So that's one thing that we'll have to fix. The next thing that we have to fix is when we updated the individual form state. Now we can actually keep this largely the same if we do form state dot answers and then ID. You can see the site doesn't break here because what it's going to do is it's going to create the property value of name or birthday inside of the form state. And you can see as we type, gosh, this still all works. Now it works again because it's binding the form state.answers and then we're passing the string of name or the string of birthday in here, and then that's going to create that property. If you want to see this in action here, we can always, just for funsies, we can do a JSON.stringify. We can pass in form state in here. Again, see how this is just a JavaScript expression here? You can see the shape of our state right away. So we can say Scott, and then as we get our birthday, which is currently not the correct type of field, we could say hi. Okay. I'm wondering why it's not the correct type of field, because we have type, we are passing in the type, which means that I got the type wrong here. It's a type of date. There we go. Type of date, date picker, Scott. Look at that. You can see how our object adjusts. It's really pretty neat. And that means when we actually go to submit this form, all we have to do is look at formState.answers to get the answers for all of our form. Okay, well, this is really super good. Now, this would be easy if you were having a form that was simply just a bunch of questions. And then anytime you added a new question, for instance, question, what's your favorite color? ID, color. And actually, is there a type of color? I know there's a color picker. Let's try color. Check it out. What's your favorite color? Yeah, we got a color picker going, okay? And this all works really well where we now have an extendable form that allows us to add as many questions as we want. But if we only want to show one form question at a time with a button that increments it, what might we do? Well, we can create a function here, and this function can be next step. What this next step function will do is simply accept an ID that's a string. Then it's going to look inside of if formState.answers and then grab the ID to grab the right field. If it is not equal to an empty string, then we can do formState.step plus equals 1 again. And again, we can say formState.error, just like we had all before, is going to be cleared out into an empty string. And we can also say else. Else is going to be formState.error is equal to please fill out the form input. That's not really a user-friendly message, but who cares? Okay, so this right now, obviously the UI is not using this next step function, so let's add a button down here inside of our, we can actually end it inside of our snippet, inside of the article button. On click is equal to next step, and we'll say next. And you'll see here that it's giving me some TypeScript error. Now this is actually saving us from a bug because it's saying that it's trying to pass in the event. By default, when you have an on-click event, just like other JavaScript frameworks, if you don't specify a parameter and you pass in the function just like this, the parameter that it actually gives you is the event. So there you could do things like event.prevent default, etc. But if we want to actually call this as a function and pass in a value, you need to have an inline arrow function. This is pretty typical amongst JavaScript frameworks. And you may notice that this is bad logic here because if these values don't exist, then it actually is going to pass because we're checking to see if it isn't equal to a negative string. So you just want to check to make sure it's a truthy value. So if this is a truthy value, then you can go to the next step, otherwise show the error. Now when we click this, you can see that we do get the please fill out form input if we click any of them. And the step is not changing. Now we only want to show one at a time, so we can do a simple if statement inside of our loop. So we have our each questions, pound if the form state dot step is equal to the what? Well, if we're thinking about this as a loop, we would say like the index, right? If the index were in the first one, show the first one. The second one, show the second one. But how do we get an index from our loop? Well, you get an index by saying comma I, or index, or whatever you would like. Some people just use I, some people use index. So we can say like so. All right, this is all pretty good. Now we're only having one question show up. I click next, gives us an error. I fill out my name, Scott. I click next, shows the next input. Likewise, same thing with the error. We can test all of these, but what's so nice about this is it's repeatable, okay? And select my favorite color. If my favorite color is black, then so be it. Okay, so, wow, this is pretty cool. Now, obviously, we hit step 4 here, and we're, at a bit of a state. So let's go ahead and add some more conditionals just to make our form even nicer, because now we care about this stuff. So if form state dot step is greater than or equal to questions dot length, then what we want to show is a thank you message, right? Thank you. Otherwise, with an else, show it like this. So now I'm not going to go through this whole form, or if I am, I'm just going to do one clicks here. There we go. We're just trying to get to the thank you message. Boom, thank you, and it no longer shows the form. Now, typically what you do in this situation is you're listening for this form function. When you check the length, and you're going to submit it. And granted, you would probably put the whole thing inside of a real form anyways, because really what we're just changing is the display on a bunch of inputs. But as you can see here, we now have a really nice, fully functioning form. This is really pretty incredible, and it works really super nice. And if we were to clean up some of this code here, it would all look and feel very nice. So in the next part, we're going to get into first lifecycle and then animations, because we're going to be able to animate this really easily with some built-in Svelte utilities that you should absolutely know out of the box. And you probably are wondering about how to run code, whether on mount or when things change or for side effects. Again, if you're the type of person who's coming from other frameworks, that's a use effect type of situation. Or maybe if even you're coming from older versions of Svelte, that's a $: type of situation. So we'll be talking about all that and more next. If you need to take a break, now's a good time to do so before we get into the next section. Okay, now we're going to get into the part where we learn about things like effect, which are for, people often say they're for something called side effects, but I always found that to be so jargony, because really it just means this code runs when something else happens. Now I guess side effect is fine for that, but I think that can confuse some people about why these things exist. So when something happens, when some data has changed, or perhaps the component is mounted or something like that, this code will run. Okay, now in previous versions of Svelte, you could have this reactive code working just by a simple $ and then brackets like this. And this was a pretty common pattern. And it was a little confusing for people. You could even do a reactive if statement by throwing an if in here in case you wanted to, run this code reactively if an if statement is conditionally true. And in Svelte 5, we've kind of taken an approach that may feel sadly React-like, but in reality is not. Now, the only thing that is React-like is the word effect, because the way these things work is very similar to how these blocks worked inside of Svelte before, but now we have $ effect like this. And what goes inside of an effect is a function, typically done like this with an inline arrow function. Now, what typically goes inside of an effect is an inline arrow function like this. Now, what's interesting here is that this code, by default, will run onMount. So if we say console.log mounting, or let's even just say onMounted. Now, if I refresh this, you can see this runs once, and no matter what I do to this, this will not run again. There's no reason for this to run again. Now, part of what's interesting about Svelte in general, like we mentioned, because it's compiled, we don't have to worry about running functions. We can worry about values changing and how values change. But it also means we get to track if values changed. So this, by default, is an onMount. So after the component has loaded, this code will run. Now, what about on unmount? And to do this, it's a return an arrow function here. And this isn't just on unmount necessarily, because one, we're not even going to unmount this component. But this right here will run one when unmounted or destroyed, aka this component has been removed, either like an if statement, a key block, or anything like that, then this is going to be run. And it could also, though, run when an effect reruns. So before the effect reruns. Because like an use effect in React or anything else, this is not just an onMount. This actually can track changes and listen for changes and then run some code whenever something changes. So if we want to see that in action, I'm going to have a second effect here. And we're going to say effect. And again, this takes a function like this. And now, instead of just console logging a string and having this run either when it's created or destroyed, we're going to say console.log, and then we're going to say form state, comma, form state dot name. Actually, there is no name property, I'm sorry. Form state dot step. Okay, so now each time the form step is run, it's going to output the form state. So what's different about this versus this is that this is using a reactive value inside of here, and this will rerun when form state.step has changed. And that's pretty amazing, because in a React context, you're passing in a second array full of the string values of the dependencies that will change. Inside of Svelte, because we're dealing with a compiler here, Svelte knows that, hey, we're using this variable, and therefore if this variable should change, then we need to rerun this function. If we want to see this in action, just watch the console down here. I can even bump it up in size and clear it out so that way we can see that, yeah, I'm typing, nothing's happening, but the moment I click next, you can see that this function has rerun. And likewise, when I do it again, it will rerun again. And this can do anything you want. It can listen for changes here and do this. You can have this listen to any value, and once that value changes, it will then rerun. And likewise, what we said about the onDestroy, this will now run before the effect reruns. So before form state reruns, and reruns. There we go. And actually, let's output the form state.step in here too, just to see what happens, right? You might be very curious to see what happens. Let me clear this console. Let's start here. I'm going to add my name. I'm going to click next. And when we click next, you're going to see that before form state reruns, it actually gets the current value of the step, which is 1, and then the form state is step is 1. So it's not giving you the before the state itself changes, it's giving you before this function itself reruns. Now, I don't end up using this that often unless it's something like, you create a set interval and you want to destroy it, maybe for some particular reason, maybe on component mount or unmount. These are the types of things like if you want a cleanup process, you typically use this return function for a cleanup process. Now, a lot of people like to make effect seem more scary than that, and especially in React land, I think it can feel more scary than that, but really all you need to know is this thing will run when something has changed, this thing will run when something has mounted or unmounted. And, the Svelte docs specifically even describe effect as an escape hatch. It's useful for things like direct DOM manipulation, but it's not a tool that you should need to use frequently. In fact, the times that we needed reactive statements the most, we're doing things like direct DOM manipulation via the audio player on the Svelte, on the Syntax website. Now, the last thing we need to necessarily even talk about effect, because I don't think we need to spend too much time on it other than this is how it works. And when you need it reactive statement, this is what you do. But the thing that is important to know inside of these is that what you should not do is don't create state based off other state in effect. We talked about this earlier on in this course when we used the derived rune, and that's when you're going to reach for derived. So I'm just adding this simple note in here, use derived. If you ever have a state that relies or is based on another piece of state, that's not a time to reach for an effect. That's time to derive your state from that. You can go back and watch earlier in this video where we talk about that. Now, I've covered a lot of stuff in this course, and I still have some more things to cover, but I do want to say, if you go to the Svelte 5 documentation, you will see a lot of interesting runes that we have not and will not discuss in this course. Things like effect.pre, effect.traffing, effect.root, or even props.snapshot. There are additional runes inside of Svelte that we will not be covering specifically because they are almost entirely for advanced cases, and you will not necessarily need to reach for them unless you do. And because this is a beginner's course, I want to keep this very beginner friendly. Now, before we get into animations, which is super fun and not something that's changed from Svelte 4 to Svelte 5, but something I feel like is definitely needs to be covered within a beginner's course, is the inspect rune. Now, inspect is a debugging rune, and it works like a console log. However, it will update anytime a reactive value has been updated. So if we were to say form state.step right here, you'll see something interesting. And in fact, let me even comment out the effects really quick down here so that way we don't get our form state logging a whole bunch and clouding it up. Okay, I'm going to refresh. You can see that we have a new console log here, and it says init 0, which is interesting. And what that's saying is that this has run, inspect has run once on initialization. This value has been initialized to the value of 0. And you'll see something very neat when we actually update our value. So when we go to step number 2, it says update 1, which means that this will always run whenever this value has changed, and it will always give you if it's been initialized or updated. So that way you can tell if variables or reactive variables that you intended to write are actually updating or not, or if they're updating too frequently for some particular reason. Maybe you've written something where values are updating and they're not supposed to. And so this becomes an incredibly handy tool. I ended up writing a quick little extension for this. I believe it's called Svelte Wrap, not Warp, Wrap. Svelte Wrap. It's right here. If you would like to use this it only has 13 downloads. I don't imagine a ton of people are using this, but I use this all the time. If I have a variable, you can do this with a snippet too, so you don't need an extension. But if you have a variable, something like questions right here, you could have your mouse cursor on questions. You could hit a keyboard shortcut, default being Command I, and it automatically gives you this inspect right here. This ends up being super useful anytime you have state variables you've just defined somewhere and you want to quickly inspect them. You can move it here and then do .step to get that value. This is just a nice little shorthand. By no means do you have to use this, and judging by its 13 downloads, I would imagine that not a lot of people are dying to use this just yet. So just a small thing. Inspect is a really neat one that I felt like you should know. Okay. Now it's time to get into animations, which this is a Svelte, going back, Svelte 3 feature. This is a feature that's existed for Svelte in a long time, but maybe you're not used to working in a framework as full-featured as Svelte is, because they can add things like animations directly to the framework and not have it really bloat the framework because we're compiling it, right? You don't have to ship this code if you don't want to, but if you want these animations, it's nice and easy. So let's talk about how we might do this. We can actually come down here to where we have our form step. Now, anytime you end up having an if statement or other conditional blocks, there's a block called key, which we didn't talk about, that changes if the key has changed. What you can do is you can wrap something in a div or an element here, like so. And on this, you can give it the directive of transition. And transition, we could say something like transition fly, and this is going to be equal to an object. Now, inside of here, you could give it how you want it to transition. You could say X is going to move over 200 pixels. It's going to take a duration of 200. What is it? 200 is 200 milliseconds. And then we're also going to change the opacity to 0 as it happens. Now, I have a full tutorial course on Svelte animations themselves on syntax, formerly under Level Up Tutorials, so you can go check that out on levelup.video. But this is going to be all we need to have a simple animation. Now, we do need to import fly. It says we might have a name for it. If you do command period on VS Code, it asks you if you want to import it. You can always just type this out as well. But that import looks a little something like this. Import fly from Svelte transition. Now, if I come in here, enter my name, there we go, nice little swap. Now, you will notice that they kind of pop in and pop out. That's because there's no position absoluting going on. You'd probably want to add some position absolute here. Or instead of just saying transition in fly, we can say transition in fly, and we're going to go, X is going to come 200 pixels, duration, and then opacity 0. And then likewise, we're going to say out fly. X is going to be negative 200 pixels, duration will be 200, opacity will be 0. Okay, let's try this out and see how this works. So now one's going to come in one direction and out the other. Whoop. Okay. Now we're still getting that little blurb. So let's add a delay of 200 pixels to the in. That way we can tune the in to be different than the out. So if we say Scott, we're going to animate out first and then animate in 200 milliseconds later. Check it out. Beautiful. And this right here is out of the box. Endlessly awesome that this just exists. This just exists with very little code. Now you could do it with transition and always throw a position absolute inside of a container on these. That can get a little wonky. Another technique you can do is do a display grid and overlay them as a grid. These are more or less animation problems more than Svelte's problems specifically because you're overlaying two elements on top of each other. But if you're worried about a delay of 200 milliseconds here, it's really, as you could tell, really snappy with what was going on here. Now, in addition to fly, there's a whole bunch of different transitions. There's fade, blur, fly, slide, scale, draw, crossfade, and there's a whole bunch of these that you can see taking place in examples on svelte.dev. Now, I have no doubt that this site is going to look a little bit different once Svelte 5 drops, so it's going to be a little bit different, but these will all still be here. Now, a little bit more advanced techniques that we get to in the Svelte animations course are things like Svelte Animate, where you can actually do flip transitions where it's first, last, invert, play. It's a really nice way of doing amazing transitions. There's a whole easings package. There's even something called Svelte Motion where you can have string values that give you interpolated JavaScript string number values, so that way you can do animations really customly. I mean, the amount of stuff that you can do with this is pretty unreal. Now, before we get out of here, the last thing I want to show you is complex state within Svelte. Now, state can get more complex than this. I'm just going to show you how you can create state outside of a Svelte component and then create instances of that state within a Svelte component. We're not going to get too deep on this because I do believe this is a more intermediate technique, but I do want to show that this exists. Now, in Svelte 5, one of the cool things you can do is use these runes and sort of this interactive and this reactive state and things like that outside of a Svelte component. Not something you could do before, but you do have to use a svelte.ts or JS file. So I'm going to create a quick state.svelte.ts file. Okay. Inside of here, I'm going to create a function which is create state. I'm just keeping this very generic here. And inside of create state, we're going to have a new value. Value is going to be equal to state. And this is going to be like a 0, like so. And what we'll want to do is have a function, which is just going to be named up. So function up. Now, I can't even spell up correctly. All right, now function up is just going to take the value and plus equals 1 to it. Okay, so we're going to increment the value by 1. Now, last thing we're going to do is we're going to return out of here. Now, in Svelte 5, if you want to get the most recent value of your state, you need to use something called a get function. And this is going to be get value is going to return the most up-to-date value that exists. So when you call .value on the state that we end up creating, which I'll show you in just a second, you will then get access to the most up-to-date version of value, which will in fact take into up or down or whatever you may have. So we're returning essentially a state container that will have the value right here by a get function, or in fact you can have a comma and then output the up function itself. So this is our create state. It gives me a red underline because it's never been used. So let's export this. I'm going to head into the header here because this is just kind of extraneous. And I'm going to import create state from /state.svelte. Okay. From here, I can create a new custom state object here by saying const my state is equal to create state. And this now gives us access to doing things like, let's put this in a button. This is just kind of extraneous code here, okay? My state dot value, which is going to be 0. You can see it's 0, right? We're having to access this as a method or a property using the get method here. So if we say on click, we also exposed our myState.up function. We can just call it like this. So now whenever we click this, my state that's inside of the state container will update. Okay, so I hope this makes sense. Now, what you cannot do from this now, and you could using writables in Svelte before, we couldn't make a function that says my state.value is equal to 10, right? You might want to update my state this way. If we click this, it's not going to let you. It's going to give you an error. So, but this is actually possible using a set function. So if we say set value, like so, all we have to do is say value is equal to, and then the new value comes in as an argument, new value, like this. And then we just need a comma. Now if we click this, we won't get an error. It'll go straight to 10. We're able to set. But you need these getters and setters. So what you can end up doing is you can end up building these really complex state wrappers with their own methods. And what's nice about this is that you can expose the API that you would like to expose. If I don't want users to hand set the value, if I only want them to be able to increment it, then I only expose the up or down method or whatever I have here. It gives you a ton of control over how you write your state. Okay, that's all really neat, right? But you might be like me and see these getters and setters and think, man, that's a lot of work. That's a lot of work to do what we used to do with readable and writable, those types of things, if you use that in Svelte. Or personally, you might just see this and say, this looks like a lot of extra code to just get a value, right? Now I want to introduce you to a way of doing state that you might initially not feel super excited about, but once you see the comparison, I think you might be interested. So I'm going to do export class, and we're going to call this Scott state. Okay, yeah, that's right. I'm going classes here. And you'll see why in a second this pattern ends up being really nice for Svelte, especially if you compare it to this one down here. So if we say value, and value is once again going to be a rune state like this, where we give it a 0. And then we also have our up function defined like this as a method of a class. We can then say this, yeah, that's right, we're using this, dot value plus equals 1. Okay, you could do plus plus 2 here if that's your thing. Okay, let's go ahead and use this first before we really compare them, but this is it, 7 lines of code. Then we head to our header, we import Scott state, we create const my state2 is equal to new Scott state. Yeah, we're using new. These are classes, right? So this is what we have going here, what we have cooking. And now let's duplicate this. However, before we do that, I'm actually going to return this to where we were just calling my value like this. Okay. And we'll duplicate this. We'll say my state2.value, my state2. Sorry, this should be up, and this should be up. Now, one thing you'll notice here is that all the TypeScript errors go away. We have 2 buttons. We click this one, it works. We click this one, hey, not so much. What's interesting about this one is that we end up having to do a function where we call this method. You can't just have it my state2.up, but you'll see that this now works exactly like this one works, and we've now created state in 2 separate ways. They both function the exact same. The only major difference is really how concise they are authored, right? Because this one, yeah, that's kind of a lot of code to just do what we just did. But when you get into classes, it feels really nice. And what's cool about classes is you can have private values, you can have public values, you can have methods, you can utilize the constructor, those types of things. And this pattern ends up feeling really good in Svelte a lot of the time. So feel free to use classes to create more complex state if you'd like. This is how you do it. So that's it. And this is about as advanced of a technique we're going to get into in this course. Now, before we go, I want to pop open the docs here, and I want to talk about what we didn't cover. Because, again, these are the Svelte 5 beta docs. This will become the normal docs once it drops. Again, this is just for me showing you what you aren't seeing in this course. There are several runes we did not talk about. There is state.raw, which will just give you raw values that can't be mutated. States.snapshot takes a static snapshot. You could think of it as like something you might use for a deep clone. Derived we talked about, but we did not talk about derived by, which is the same as derived, but you get an inline arrow function and you can do a little bit more. So if the stuff that you're doing in derived can't be accomplished with just a single one-liner, then you use derived by. Effect we mentioned, effect.pre, effect all this stuff are not things that you're going to need to get into, and are mostly for niche cases. I'm scrolling through all this stuff. These are the runes that we have not talked about. So effect.pre runs before the DOM updates, and it's not super common that you need that. Effect.tracking just gives you whether or not effect is currently tracking a value, which I've seen people use this, and I gotta be honest, I still don't get the use case. It's one of those things that I'm sure I'll hit eventually, but just goes to show you that you can get a lot done without ever needing things like this. Effect.root is an advanced root that creates a non-tracked scope that doesn't auto clean up. Man, this is useful for nested effects. So this is getting into some really intense stuff. Likewise, we talked about props and typing props, but we didn't talk about bindable. Now, if you have a value that's being bound, you saw that we used bind inside of input values. When you have a prop that is bound to a child component, so let's say you're binding a value in a child component, and that value you expect to change up the DOM tree, up the Svelte component tree, like you update a value in a child component and you want it to change in the parent as well, then you use in your props declaration bindable, you use the prop name and then bindable. Bindable is a function. So if you have a prop that needs to be changing in the parent, you need to use this bindable as well to have that work. We did talk about inspect. Inspect is great. Now there's another one called host, which retrieves the this reference of the custom element that contains this component. But it's only available when you're using custom element components, which in itself is not a common way to work in Svelte. Now, in addition, we talked about snippets. We talked about naming snippets, maybe nested snippets. We talked about how to use them as children. We did talk about event handlers. Anytime you have an event, whether that's on click, on anything, you now have it just be on the word. Okay, so we typically see this in on click. Now, in addition, there's also a bunch of intense fine-grained reactivity state examples we did not talk about in case you want to get into some really intense state, like we showed you how you can create .svelte state files and use state as a function or a class outside of a component. That stuff is all exists, but there's more here there. Let me know what you want to see in an intermediate or advanced version of this, because now we definitely hit all of the beginner use cases for this, but as we've been using Svelte, I've been using it for a long time. I built several major sites with it, or even using Svelte for the syntax site. There are certainly a lot of use cases that you will hit over your time of working with this, but I hope this was seen as a really good introduction and a good basis for the syntax, maybe possibly the syntax changes of Svelte 5. Stay up to date with syntax on YouTube. We will be doing videos showing how we convert Svelte 4 components to Svelte 5 if you're coming from Svelte 4 and want to see what that conversion looks like. So as always, this is Scott with Syntax. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Smash that subscribe button, follow the Syntax podcast anywhere you get your podcasts, and I will catch you in the next one.